It's here at the extreme tip of the continent that the story of Africa's nature reserves begins. Man had always lived in harmony with nature in this part of the world. Then, one day in the 17th century, some boats arrived carrying the first white men, and although the animals didn't know it, this was to mark the beginning of all their troubles. 300 years later, this part of the shoreline still has plenty of charm, but there are no more rhinos, no more elephants. And the quagga, a sort of zebra that thrived here, has literally disappeared from the face of the earth. There's no longer the profusion of wildlife that so surprised the first settlers, just a few token animals looking rather forlorn. These great antelopes are bonteboks. There are only a few dozen left. Like the elands, vast herds of them used to roam the dunes. After they completely disappeared, they were reintroduced into this small reserve in the Cape of Good Hope, where they still live today in the company of a few other mammals. The first European settlers found themselves in a land of plenty, where nature reigned supreme. Every landscape was a marvel, and the wildlife thrived in the luxuriant vegetation. The further they penetrated inland, the more the newcomers discovered plants, animals, and scenery, the likes of which they had never seen before. But their amazement was short-lived. Respecting their new environment was the last of their concerns. They had come here to force nature, to tame it, to lay roads, clear fields, and cut down trees. People came here to seek their fortune by working the land, raising cattle, or prospecting for gold in the rivers in the north of the country. At the end of the 19th century, a colony of immigrants worked a gold seam along this river in Transvaal. They were almost all Scottish, so they baptized the river Mac Mac, and the falls downstream the Mac Mac Falls. There was little in the way of entertainment for the prospectors. They could either go swimming down at the Mac Mac Falls or go hunting round about. They shot at anything that moved, if there was anything left to shoot at. As the successive waves of settlers arrived in southern Africa, they would pick the landscape clean. They killed all the predators they could to prevent them from eating their livestock, and they killed the herbivores to prevent them from transmitting diseases to their cattle. Even when they were just passing through a region, they would kill everything in sight, just to try out the latest models of rifle. In those days, the wildlife was so abundant that they may have thought they could go on forever, but the animals' numbers dwindled. Either they were massacred or they fled north as the settlers advanced. By the end of the 19th century, there were still some animals left, of course, but nowhere near as many as the early hunters had known. One of them decided to do something about it, and he had the power to do it, for he was none other than Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal Republic. His idea was simple: to mark out areas where hunting would be prohibited and the animals could breed and thrive again in peace. In 1894, Kruger created the first protected natural park in Africa, a simple game reserve covering 50,000 acres called the Pongola Game Reserve. 4 years later, he marked out another protected area between the Sabi and Crocodile rivers. The Sabi Game Reserve has since been rechristened Kruger Park in homage to its founder. Kruger Park is now 4 times larger than it was originally. It's 200 miles long and 40 miles across and lies in the northeast of South Africa on the border with Mozambique. In 1927, Kruger and his friends turned the old game reserve into a national park and opened it to the public. The first year, the park did not get many visitors, and visiting it was quite an adventure. There were few trails, and people often went astray, sometimes permanently. To cut down the number of accidents, they decided to close the park in the rainy season. Over the years, the park's reputation grew and more visitors arrived. Attracted by wildlife, there was little opportunity to see elsewhere. The list is most impressive. It includes 500 varieties of birds, 100 different kinds of reptiles, and 147 species of mammals. One of the finest collections of animals to be found anywhere in Africa. Today, Kruger Park is crisscrossed by 1,200 miles of well-kept tarmac roads and trails, and every year it welcomes almost 1 million visitors. The reason the park has so many animals is that they have virtually nothing to fear anymore. Every inch of the park is well guarded and has been for many years. Kruger Park employs a total of 3,500 people, some in nature conservation and others in tourism. A highly rational and elaborate system of environmental management is used here. Water is redistributed scientifically, for example, by pumping it from one part of the park to another. And certain animal populations, such as the elephants, are artificially culled. Geared essentially to efficiency, the park's philosophy today bears little resemblance to the ideals of its founders. One of them wrote, "I'm convinced that nature can resolve her own problems far better than man." Here, every animal and every plant is analyzed and inventoried. The park has become a reference where wildlife research is concerned. Kruger Park is a veritable business venture, Western style. In the days of apartheid, it was run by white men from A to Z. The original African population didn't really feel concerned. In 1992, the ANC spokesman announced that when they came to power, the country's new leaders would dismantle the park and redistribute the land to the black population. But when it came to it, they didn't do it. All over Africa, it was the same old story. The arrival of the white man brought about an ecological disaster, and a few decades later they tried in one way or another to limit the damage. Not out of any concern for the natural environment, but above all to make sure that there would always be game to hunt. In 1905, in the heart of Tanganyika, which was later to become Tanzania, German settlers created one of the first reserves in East Africa, the Selous Reserve. It's a vast tract of virgin land covering 20,000 square miles and teeming with animals. Today it's the largest protected area in the whole of Africa, and much of it is still reserved for hunting. In 1884, a scientist and explorer by the name of Johnston said of this part of eastern Africa, "It's the largest hunting ground in the world." News travels fast in the select circle of wealthy hunters. At the beginning of the 20th century, US President Theodore Roosevelt himself made the long trip to Africa and roamed these landscapes, chalking up trophies. One of the hunters' favorite spots is to be found in the north of Tanzania. It's an ocean of dry grassland bordered by some rocky foothills. The indigenous tribes call it the Endless Plain, Serengeti in the Masai language. Before becoming a great national park in 1951, this land was a scene of unimaginable slaughter. The hunters knew they could easily bag a leopard there as it took a nap in a sausage tree. Curiously, lions too would nestle on a branch and make an easy target in exchange for such a glorious trophy. You can get an idea of what the hunting was like from these words penned by just such a hunter. "We bagged 52 lions," he writes. "I think we were a little heavy-handed." There was some reaction against these excesses. Shooting from aeroplanes was banned, for example. The Serengeti ecosystem is crossed by a boundary that was literally traced with a ruler, regardless of any natural references, between Kenya and Tanzania. On the Kenyan side, it's called the Mara, Masai Mara, because it's in Masai country. These nomadic herdsmen came from Ethiopia and the Nile Valley a few hundred years ago and settled peacefully on the high plateaus of Kenya with their herds. They're herdsmen through and through. They scorn farming and hunting, except lion hunting, that is, when a lion threatens their herds. For centuries, the Masai not only lived in harmony with the wildlife, but they also protected it by systematically driving any farming or hunting peoples up into the mountains. If there are so many animals on these expanses, the white men owe it to the Masai, but they received little thanks for it. Instead, a large part of their territory was made into a reserve, the South Reserve. They were allowed to go on living there, but without their weapons. Their lances, their only means of defense against the lions, were confiscated. In 1927, something was finally done to remedy this situation and protect them and their herds from wild animals. But instead of returning their weapons to them, white hunters were brought in to clean up the region. The effect on the big cat population was devastating. In 1930, the situation in this part of eastern Africa was bad for the Masai and catastrophic for the animals. On the most fertile land, the white settlers were moving in fast. More and more land was under crop, and the farms were closer and closer together. The population was rapidly expanding, and wildlife was becoming increasingly undesirable. In what remained of the wilderness, hunting was a well-organized and lucrative business. Safaris, hunting rights, trophies, the ivory trade brought in plenty of money. Only the wealthy could afford to go big game hunting. This ruled out most black people. Too poor to afford a license, they took to poaching instead. No matter how generous nature could be in these regions, there is a limit. The cards were too heavily stacked against her. Her treasures were being dilapidated. Voices began to ring out, demanding protective measures to preserve the natural heritage, and for once they had no ulterior motives. It was a romantic movement, inspired by writers and artists fascinated by this wild beauty that they were discovering at the same time as they were watching it die. They stirred consciences and raised funds. They lobbied for national parks to be set up in this part of Africa along the lines of those in the United States, sanctuaries where the animals would be safe from harm. Kenya opened its first national parks after the Second World War. They're located in very different zones and natural habitats. The Aberdares National Park lies in a mountain range in the heart of the country. The protected area is at an altitude of 10,000 feet. Access is difficult. Downpours are frequent and violent there, producing waterfalls galore. Kenyans have always called these mountains the Nyandaruas, but in 1884 the white settlers renamed them after Lord Aberdare, chairman of the Royal Geographical Society, who financed an expedition there. These waters are full of rainbow trout. The species was introduced by settlers in 1907 and has prospered in these cold waters. The Aberdares National Park covers barely 230 square miles. It's no match for Tsavo, which was made a national park at about the same time, but which lies in the vast expanses of eastern Kenya. Tsavo is immense, 8,000 square miles, and conditions are different. Here there's no farming, and the region is infested with tsetse flies. Apart from a few Wata tribes, hardly anybody lives here. The Watas have been elephant hunters since time immemorial. When the park was set up in 1948, they turned their ancestral skills to poaching. Contrary to all their traditions, when they killed an elephant, they would leave the meat to rot and just take the tusks for ivory. Poaching was rife everywhere in those days, and the authorities decided to protect a small area at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro, known as Amboseli. Game is plentiful there, especially in the swamplands where the water table is fed by the snow melting on Mount Kilimanjaro. Initially, Amboseli was simply a game reserve. In other words, certain human activities were authorized there. For an area to be reserved exclusively for wildlife, it has to be made a national park. Kenya's very first national park was created here in 1945, on the site of an old public park that was regularly used as an army depot. It's without doubt the most amazing nature reserve in the country. With its plains, its rivers and its swamplands, the landscape is typical of the wide open spaces of Eastern Africa and of their diversity. All sorts of ecosystems are found here, but on a reduced scale, for this national park covers only 45 square miles. It's located right in the heart of the country. It's the Nairobi National Park, only a stone's throw from the capital. The park met with a lot of opposition from the local population at first. Nobody thought it would work. They all thought the wildlife would not take to living so close to civilization. But in fact, 10 years later, it houses a surprising variety of animals. For some species, the park has become a veritable refuge. Only the elephants are missing. Their way of life is too destructive for such a small area. None of the animals seem to mind living so close to a capital city with a population of 2 million. The closeness of the city is quite disconcerting. It does cause problems, of course. To stop big cats from straying into people's homes and giraffes from strolling through the streets, the park has been fenced off from the city with about 25 miles of fencing. But in spite of the fences, the park has nothing in common with a giant zoo. It's wide open to the south, and the animals are free to come and go as they please. It's a wonder how the Nairobi National Park has managed to withstand the pressure, the speculation, the temptation surrounding so much prime land so close to the city. Some Kenyans take out yearly season tickets just so they can take a shortcut through the park to commute to work every day. But for most of them, this rather unusual park has become the symbol of the importance they attach to their natural heritage. In 1989, the country's stock of ivory was solemnly burnt here to mark the end of years of poaching and indifference among the African people towards the fate of their wildlife. What stronger symbol than these tusks? The sad reminder of all those lost herds. In the 20th century, the idea of creating protected areas has gained ground all over the African continent. It has helped to curb the massacres, but not to stop them altogether. Elephants have been slaughtered by the thousands, even in the national parks. But the opening of each new park is a sign marking a certain determination, even when protection remains utopian. In Cameroon, the Waza National Park was created in 1934 to protect the giraffes. The Waza Park lies in the far north of the country near the borders with Nigeria and Chad. It covers an area of 650 square miles, half of which is forest and the other half flood plains that reach as far as the eye can see. These vast wet plains are called yaeres. In the rainy season, they're completely flooded by the overspill from two rivers, the Logone and the Chari. When the water withdraws in the dry season, it leaves small lakes that play an essential part in the life and activities of the park. The whole region is faced with a serious drought situation, forcing the animals to travel long distances in search of water. But even at the height of the drought, they're sure to find water here without leaving the protection zone. Some of the watering holes are man-made. If necessary, when conditions are very extreme, they're painstakingly filled with water from tankers. That way, the park authorities are sure to be able to protect as many animals as possible, come what may. At times, the wildlife is so thick around the waterholes that it can be reminiscent of the great parks of eastern Africa. At Waza, tourists are still scarce, but the authorities dream of eventually attracting foreign currency like the parks in southern Africa, Tanzania and Kenya. Africa has come a long way in the space of a few years in the art of creating protected spaces for wildlife, but also in that of selling them. Visitors to the parks are a vital source of income in the countries concerned. Sometimes you can even lose sight of the real motivation. Is protecting wildlife an end in itself, or is it simply a form of economic development, regardless of the impact on wildlife? Nowadays, Kenya devotes a little over 7% of its territory to national parks and game reserves. There are more than 50 of them. It's becoming increasingly necessary to erect barriers to separate people and their crops from the spaces reserved for animals. Apart from the Tsavo Park, most of the protected spaces are fairly small, and some are very small indeed. The smallest national park in Kenya lies in the northwest of the country, very near the border with Uganda. It's a stretch of swampland called the Saiwa Swamp. It really is a pocket-sized park, covering an area of less than 1 square mile. Above all, the swamp houses an amazing variety of bird life. It includes crowned cranes and yellow-billed storks, but also less common species like the Hadada ibis. Around the swamps, turacos share the trees with monkeys. There are several rare species, like the colobus or the debraza monkey. In such a small area, of course, there are no big cats, so visitors can enjoy a rare pleasure which is virtually unheard of in other national parks, that of exploring the park on foot. Being off the beaten tourist track, the park doesn't get too many visitors. Most of those who do make the detour come to see the sitatungas, a very shy breed of swamp antelopes which are always difficult to observe. There are dozens of them here, but at the slightest alert they wade deep into the swamp, so you can never be sure of a sighting. To give visitors a better chance to see these water antelopes, several observation posts have been set up, giving a good overall view of the park. The Saiwa Swamp Park was actually created specially to protect the few sitatungas that live there, but the protection thus provided also benefits the extremely fragile ecosystem as a whole. These few acres of nature are a world apart in a region whose environment has been badly ravaged. This whole region, which has now been cleared for farming, used to be covered with a great primeval forest, a formidable green belt that crossed the whole of Africa from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. "10,000 years ago, Africa underwent a sudden change of climate, marked among other things by a sharp decrease in rainfall. This caused some of the forest to disappear, and man did the rest. Only a small pocket remains in the region of Kakamega, about 60 miles south of Saiwa Swamp. In theory, this forest is protected, but it too is fast disappearing. In the last 30 years, it has shrunk by half. These great trees were exploited for timber quite legally until 1980. By the time the ecological value of the forest became apparent, considerable damage had already been done, and the local people had developed some bad habits. A large population lives in the immediate vicinity of the protected area. They didn't come here by chance. They came to exploit the riches it offered: food, coal, and even a gold seam that was discovered here in 1923. Even today, the forest is a place where people just help themselves, to cater for their everyday needs or to earn a little extra money. This is now illegal, of course, but it goes on quite openly. Kakamega has never had real national park status. It's just a forest reserve, and the protection measures are fairly vague. This depletion of the forest's resources is haphazard and wasteful, which only makes matters worse. Not only is the forest shrinking, but it no longer has the capacity to renew itself. The authorities want to save this piece of forest, but to confiscate it from the local people is out of the question. So they're trying to devise a form of management and exploitation which will give the forest the protection it needs and still be acceptable to the population. Africa now wants to exploit its own land and resources to improve its standard of living. It's the end of a certain approach to conservation. The idea of completely virgin nature remaining unspoilt forever, a continent untouched by the hand of progress. That unrealistic ambition has had to be scaled down. Nowadays, effective protection of the natural heritage is more a matter of organizing harmonious coexistence between wildlife and human activities. These women are harvesting rice in the northwest of Africa on the border of Mauritania, in the delta of the river Senegal. They're farming the edges of a swamp that has always attracted countless birds. These 60 square miles of wetlands are protected. It's one of the 6 national parks in Senegal, the Djoudj Park. It was founded in 1971 and is one of the largest bird sanctuaries in the world. Although the ecosystem supports countless birds, it has lost most of its mammals. Only a century ago there were antelopes and hippos, giraffes and elephants. Today, apart from the warthog, the mammals have virtually disappeared altogether. The birds have not changed their behavior for thousands of years. Every year at the end of autumn, tens of thousands of them migrate here to spend the winter months in the park. They fly in from Europe, and this is the first expanse of fresh water they come to after a long, dry journey across the Sahara Desert. This strategic position on the other side of the desert made the Djoudj a favorite hibernation spot for hundreds of thousands of waders and water birds. The land farmed by the peasants around the edges of the park was regularly flooded when the waters of the river Senegal overflowed. So a dam was built to protect the farmers and their fields. The dam has changed the ecosystem of the Djoudj. The distribution of the vegetation has been radically altered. Originally, because of all the salt in the water and the soil, there were few aquatic plants, mainly rushes and water lilies. In the space of a few years, another variety, a plant called water lettuce, has spread at an amazing rate. On the vast, waterlogged expanse of the Djoudj, the water lettuce has formed an almost impenetrable carpet. These great green carpets are good for only one bird, the African jacana. This dense vegetation is a problem for all those birds whose staple diet is fish, for they need clearer water to practice their various fishing techniques. The Djoudj Park authorities are doing their best to restore the natural balance. To remedy the situation, they must restore the natural variations in the water level wherever possible. 2 small sluice gates regulate the flow of water from the river into the park. But there's no way of pumping it out again. If the level is too high, they just have to wait for it to evaporate. These are delicate operations. The ideal water level is hard to ascertain. It determines the level of salinity, which in turn affects the vegetation, and also the well-being of the birds. If the water level is too low, the herons will not nest there. But if it's too high, it's not right for the pelicans. The Djoudj Park takes special care of its pelican population. Pelicans are the most spectacular species in the park, the ones that attract the tourists. So the water level is determined largely in relation to their needs. There are several thousand white pelicans here. These large birds certainly look a little cramped on these islands, but they're better off that way. If the water level were lower, there'd be more dry land, more room for them to nest, but also more danger. When the water is too shallow, the jackals will more than likely wade across and feast on the pelicans' eggs or on their young. All these birds that are equally found in Europe detract somewhat from the exoticism of this African nature park. Although we're a long way from the African Game Reserve as we imagine it, we're right at the very crux of the reality, the diversity and the purpose of these parks. For a long time, nobody paid any attention to these birds in Europe. Nobody gave any thought to their future. When the old continent started to take an interest in nature conservation and to pass laws and decrees, they always concerned the colonies. Now, as if snubbing its nose at the origins of nature conservation there, Africa is helping in turn to protect a little of the natural heritage of Europe.